Thank you, Heather. The next and final speaker in this panel is Leo Panitch, a distinguished research professor of political science and Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy at York University in Toronto. He's also co-editor of the Socialist Register and a noted public intellectual and co-author with Sam Gindin, who I think I saw in the room, of The Making of Global Capitalism.
This has really been a great meeting, and I think we owe a vote of thanks to Herman Rosenfeld and the other people who organized it with him. This morning's panel, apart from each of the outstanding presentations, I was really struck by the insight and quality of all the comments after the panel. You know, normally, as one opens the floor for 5 or 10 minutes of questions, you think, "Oi," but it was really phenomenal. And I want to pick up a couple of the points that were made. You know, one fellow said, but were we even to manage to avoid the privatization of Ontario Hydro, what would we do to make it different so that people would want to not see it privatized again, in terms of how it's run, what it's been doing ecologically, to the unions, etc. Similarly, the fellow who made the point about how are we going to get people to want to pay taxes for the public services that we need? And you know, I do think we need to address these things, and we need to address them because, you know, if we go back to the point at which the privatization trend across the capitalist world started going back in the Thatcherite 80s, we need to remember that that privatization was supported by working people. Thatcher was able to privatize the British Railways on the grounds that, you know, do you really feel that they're yours to control, to influence, in terms of the service that are being provided, etc. And I was reminded in thinking about this talk for today, to go back to a piece almost 2 years ago in Living Toronto. It's a terrific online journal that people should look at, livingtoronto.ca. Schuster Gindin, Sam's partner, runs it. And at the time of the power outage, or just after the ice storm and the power outage in Toronto, they got Paul Cannert, who's a former Toronto Hydro worker and a leading activist in the Ontario Electricity Coalition, to talk about what it was like to work for and what it was like to think about the kinds of services provided by Toronto Hydro. And he says, let's quote a couple of short paragraphs here. Toronto Hydro's problems were completely exposed during the recent ice storm. The lack of trained, experienced people coupled with an outage management system that doesn't work made a bad situation worse. Referring to the handling of the crisis, Rob Ford called Toronto Hydro CEO Anthony Haynes the champion of champions on the floor of the council chamber. Nothing could be further from the truth. Here's some of the background. At amalgamation in 1998, Toronto Hydro had 2,600 employees. Now, after years of downsizing, there are approximately 890 unionized employees. As a result, there is a huge knowledge deficit in Toronto's hydro system, with only a handful of people left who have that knowledge gained from training and experience. At the same time, management numbers have increased by approximately 500, including 9 vice presidents at an average salary of $400,000 each. 20 newly created director positions, a $30,000 increase in salary, over 20 managers, and scores of newly hired supervisors over the last few years. Toronto Hydro now has 1 management person for every 1.8 union employees. Anthony Haynes' compensation is over $1.1 million per year, including his pension payments. He went to court to get his bonus made pensionable. In 2000, the Toronto Hydro CO pay was over $200,000. So why is this? Why is it that a public utility of this, which we know we need and we treasure, it is run this way? And I think we have to be very careful here about Adam Beck. Yes, you can go visit his statue on University, just south, I think it is, of Queen. But, you know, if you go back to a book like my colleague in history at York University, who's no lefty, Viv Nellis's book on Ontario government relations with private industry in Ontario, what he says about the creation of Ontario Hydro was the following, and I quote, "From the outset, the crusade for public power was a businessman's movement. They initiated, formed its devoted hardcore membership, and most importantly, they provided it with brilliant leadership. By the phrase, the people's power, the businessmen meant cheap electricity for the manufacturers. And it was assumed that the entire community would benefit as a result. The socially and politically influential manufacturers, who, by the way, were all anti-union at this time, right, as was Adam Beck. Where was I? The socially and politically influential manufacturers turned readily to public ownership primarily because the private electric company in Niagara refused to guarantee them an immediate, inexpensive supply of commodity on which they believed their future prosperity depended." He goes on to say, "Ontario Hydro always looked more like state capitalism than anything else, run by businessmen, for businessmen, in what was always referred to as a business-like manner." Right? And you can bet that it's the managers of Ontario Hydro today who are calling for privatization. Right? Just as the hospital administrators are calling for P3s. Right? Now, at the time of, the nationalizations in that period, when the growth of the state was partly a product of, yes, people demanding the expansion of the state for public services, for cheaper electricity for people, and so on, and it did produce that for consumers. There was an enormous debate, especially, in the UK, where the socialist experiment in Ontario and at the federal level of Ontario Hydro and Canadian National Railways was pointed to by the British Labour government as the socialist experiments in the Dominions. Well, they weren't socialists, they were state capitalists, but secondly, in the debates in the unions at that time about how the British Railways should be run, how the national coal industry should be run, there were a lot of demands for workers' control, for self-management, for at least the appointment of the boards by workers and unions and communities, and none of that ever happened. Right? And the fact that it didn't happen meant that the people who ended up running those public corporations were not in a different class than the people who ran private corporations. In fact, they saw their ambitions as becoming CEOs in the private corporations. And that remains the case today. Now, as we moved from the era of protection, when Canada used the national policy to protect local industry against competition from manufacturers in New York or Ohio or wherever, one of the reasons for having a public electric utility company was that they would then, with cheaper electricity from Niagara, be able to compete, right, against New York manufacturers, etc. But part of what's happened in the world, after all, is free trade and global competitiveness. And with the move from protection to free trade, it's hardly surprising that one of the things that is attacked, and it's not just the matter of Premier Wynne, it's the dynamic of the whole movement of globalization, right, should be public utilities, which were introduced in the first place to protect local manufacturers, right, and their private accumulation. Now that Canadian capitalists don't care whether they're accumulating in India or in Ontario, it's part of the same dynamic that this would be undermined. That's what's going on here. A second dimension of it, of course, is the financialization of capitalism, where every asset, including in private industry, shareholder value, is supposed to be a tradable asset, right? Supposed to be able to be put on the market. So this isn't just a matter here of privatizing Ontario assets, and Ed Clark and Premier Wynne are bad people. In fact, Ed Clark is probably far more progressive an individual than Adam Beck was. People forget that Ed Clark was the Deputy Minister of Finance when Trudeau's National Energy Program was introduced, and when the budget was introduced in 1981, which made Trudeau hated by every businessman in the country, was that you would tax income on the basis of a buck is a buck. It was a capital gain, it would get taxed, just as the same if it was a worker's wage, right? So this is where he comes from. What he's reflecting is a securitization of the whole economy, the financialization of the economy. And one of the things that they're trying to do here is provide tradable assets to the Canadian pension plan, which is now run as an investor, just as Goldman Sachs is run as an investor. And I assure you that when there is more privatization of Ontario Hydro, it's going to be the CPPIB. I've been learning a lot from Greg Albo about this, who's been teaching about this in his classes just in the last few days. It's going to be the teachers' pension fund that invests in this, right? And how many other union pension funds are going to be investing in this? And that brings us back to another dimension of the problem. Another dimension of the problem is that the managers who run the union pension funds, let alone the public pension funds, are also part of the same class as the people who we think we're attacking, right? When we say we're privatizing the private sector, right? What's to be done about this? Well, we do finally need to see public utilities and public ownership as part of the democratization of the economy. That's how they need to be seen. That's what we have not achieved as we have partially democratized the state. And one of the reasons that public utilities have not been democratized and that government departments have not been democratized is that it sets a bad example to the private sector if you have a democratized public sector. So, this came up, Rosario will remember it well, when the Bob Rae government got elected. All kinds of ideas were floated. Rosario had me come and speak to his ministry about how you might democratize that ministry. A lot of ideas came up at that time. To what extent can we raise the question of workers and community control in the public corporations? At least control in the sense of who gets appointed to the boards of governors, the boards of directors, for the leading executive positions, etc. In the case, let's say, of nursing homes, right, which came up today. Why isn't it the case that the civil servants who work with regard to putting forward various plans for what's to be done in policy for nursing homes should be organizing referenda amongst the people in the nursing homes and their families, where there's a choice over plan A, B, and C, which is being debated in secret inside the ministry, where it doesn't even have to be a binding referendum, but where there is input coming from the people who are being served over those options, right? That would make people feel that the service actually belongs to them, that they have some input in it. Similarly, with regard to the hospitals, and this could be put much more generally in collective bargaining in the public sector, and it's not. I once gave a keynote at an Alberta Nurses Union convention in which I suggested, this was right after they'd won their great strike, right? And when they were fined for having gone on a legal strike, they said, we're not going back, right? And if you expect us to pay those fines. It was a great success. And they were all up. And at that convention, I suggested the next round of bargaining, they should make it the top priority that 1 hour a week should be paid time on overlapping shifts where every worker on the ward, from the cleaner to the nurse, right? Indeed, even the surgery nurse should be paid to come together and discuss the labor process on the ward. And then in the second round of bargaining, they should bargain as a top priority another hour paid on overlapping shifts where all the workers on the ward are with the patients and they discuss the labor process on the ward. This again would be an attempt to democratize the public service so it meant something. Above all, I'll just finish with this, I think we need to stop being defensive. I entirely agree with the kinds of proposals that Heather has put forward, above all an infrastructure bank, but it does probably mean that we're going to have to put on the agenda in order not to be defensive about the question of why should only workers' pension funds be invested in necessary public services. After all, the money that's in the private banks is our money too, right? It raises the question of, shouldn't banking be a public utility in general? Shouldn't finance be a public utility in general? And then the question of decommodification does have to come up. And you know, what has been run in this city the last few years in terms of the demand that we have free public transit needs to be an example much more broadly. And it's to be very much hoped that the union will finally come behind that. And it isn't a matter about being defensive about it. I mean, one of the remarkable things about Sanders, I mean, really, what he's advancing is hardly socialist. He's not even a very radical New Dealer, right? But what he does say with a lot of confidence, when they say to him, it's going to take more taxes if you're going to have Canadian-style single-payer health care, he says, of course it is. But you're going to save $2,000 a year instead of paying a couple more bucks in taxes that you're now paying for private health care. He takes it on directly. He makes a case for why it's rational to have a decommodified public service and pay more taxes for it. And that isn't just a matter of fleecing the rich. After all, it's been working people who voted for parties, including the NDP, who have promised less taxes. I'll end with that.